There was a man who never said no, not once. Not to his boss, not to his neighbors, not to strangers who barely knew his name. Everyone who met him called him the kindest soul they had ever encountered. But behind closed doors, in the quiet hours of the night when the world had stopped asking things of him, he would sit alone at his kitchen table, exhausted. This is not a story about being kind. This is a story about what happens when you trade your entire life trying to keep everyone else happy, and the shocking moment he finally discovered what it had truly cost him. His name was Daniel, a 42-year-old school teacher living in a mid-sized town where everybody knew everybody. He was the man you called when your car broke down at midnight. He was the colleague who stayed 3 hours after school to help plan someone else's lesson. He was the son who drove 4 hours every weekend because his relatives had grown comfortable expecting it. Daniel was, by every outward measure, a wonderful human being. But there is a difference, a vital, life-changing difference between being genuinely generous and being unable to say no out of fear. And Daniel had never learned that difference. The town of Millhaven had a rhythm to it, and Daniel had unconsciously become one of its most reliable instruments. People didn't just appreciate him, they depended on him in a way that had quietly crossed a line. His principal knew that if any teacher called in sick, Daniel would cover the class without complaint. His neighbors knew that if they needed help moving furniture, painting a fence, or watching their dog for a weekend, Daniel would say yes before they even finished the sentence. There was even a running joke among his colleagues, "Just ask Daniel," and everyone laughed, including Daniel himself. He laughed because he didn't yet understand that some jokes are actually quiet tragedies dressed in humor.
It was a Tuesday in October when the first crack appeared, though Daniel almost missed it entirely. He had been awake since 5 in the morning, preparing the class presentation. By noon, he had covered 2 extra classes. By 4 in the afternoon, he had helped a parent rearrange the school's fundraising schedule. By 7 in the evening, he was at his neighbor's house assembling a flat-pack wardrobe. When he finally walked back into his own home at 9:30, he sat down on his couch and noticed something unsettling. He could not remember the last time he had done a single thing for himself, not one thing. He tried to remember, and the silence that answered him was louder than anything he had heard all day. What made Daniel's condition so dangerous was not the busyness, it was the belief underneath it. Deep in the architecture of his identity, Daniel had built his entire sense of worth on being needed. As a child, he had learned, the way many of us quietly learn, that love was something you earned through usefulness. His approval came from helping, his belonging came from being available. So every time he said yes to someone else, it felt like safety. And every time he even considered saying no, a quiet panic rose in his chest, a fear that without his helpfulness, people would have no reason to value him at all. He had spent decades running from that fear, and in doing so, had run straight into a life that barely felt like his own.
The turning point arrived not with a dramatic event, but with a conversation Daniel almost avoided entirely. A new teacher had joined the school that semester, a woman named Rosa, quiet and observant, with a habit of saying exactly what she meant without cruelty or hesitation. One afternoon in the staff room, she watched Daniel agree to take on yet another responsibility that clearly belonged to someone else. After the room emptied, she looked at him calmly and said, "Do you actually want to do all of this, or are you just afraid of what happens if you don't?" Daniel laughed it off the way he always did, but that night, lying in the dark, her words moved through him like a key turning slowly in a lock he hadn't known was there. Rosa's question did something uncomfortable. It made Daniel look at himself honestly for the first time in years. He began to trace the pattern. Every relationship in his life followed the same invisible script. People would ask, he would give. They would be satisfied. He would feel briefly valued. Then they would ask again, this time for more, because generosity without boundaries teaches people not gratitude, but appetite. He thought about his closest friends and realized, with a quiet devastation, that most of them had never once asked him how he was doing. Not really, not in the way that waits for a real answer. He had been so busy being useful that he had never given anyone the chance to simply know him. He had confused being needed with being loved, and the two, he was beginning to understand, are not the same thing at all. Around this time, Daniel's body began to speak the language his mind had been refusing to hear. He started waking up tired no matter how long he slept. A persistent tension settled across his shoulders that no amount of rest could ease. His doctor, during a routine checkup, used a word that stopped Daniel cold. Burnout. Not laziness, not weakness, burnout. the condition that arrives when a person has been withdrawing from their own reserves for so long that the account finally runs empty. The doctor asked him about his stress levels, his schedule, his personal time. Daniel sat in that sterile examination room and could not produce a single example of time that belonged only to him. The doctor looked at him with a kind of professional concern that felt, to Daniel, uncomfortably close to pity.
That evening, Daniel sat in his kitchen and remembered something his grandmother had told him when he was no more than 8 years old. She had placed a candle on the table between them, lit it, and said, "A candle that tries to light every room in the house will burn out before midnight, but a candle that burns steadily in one place can last the whole night through." He had been too young to understand it then. He had tucked it away the way children tuck away the things adults say, out of sight, behind everything louder and more immediate. But now, sitting in his kitchen at 42, exhausted in a way that sleep no longer fixed, the memory returned with the full weight of what it had always meant. He had been trying to light every room, and he was almost out of flame. Something shifted in Daniel after that night. Slowly, at first, the way light changes before sunrise, barely noticeable until suddenly the whole sky is different. He began to observe himself in conversations, catching the exact moment when the word yes formed automatically on his lips before his mind had even considered whether he had the capacity to follow through. He started asking himself a question Rosa had eventually shared with him. If I say yes to this, what am I saying no to? Because that is the truth most people-pleasers never confront. Every yes carries a hidden no inside it. Every time you say yes to someone else's demand, you are simultaneously saying no to your own rest, your own dreams, your own quiet moments of becoming. Daniel had been making that trade every single day without ever reading the fine print. The first time Daniel said no, his hands were shaking. It was a Friday afternoon, and his principal had stopped him in the corridor with that familiar tone, the one that assumed agreement before the question had fully landed. There was a school event on Saturday morning, and someone was needed to coordinate the setup. The principal had barely finished the sentence before Daniel felt the old reflex rise in his chest, like a refrain he had sung 1,000 times. But this time he paused. He took one slow breath, and then he heard himself say, quietly but clearly, "I'm sorry, I'm not available this weekend." The principal blinked. There was a brief, strange silence, the kind that follows something unexpected. Then the principal simply nodded and walked away to ask someone else. The catastrophe Daniel had always feared never arrived. The world did not end. And standing alone in that corridor, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years, the fragile, extraordinary sensation of having chosen himself.
But one moment of courage does not dissolve a lifetime of conditioning overnight. In the days that followed, the guilt came, thick and persistent, the way guilt always arrives when you begin to dismantle a pattern that once kept you feeling safe. He second-guessed himself constantly. He replayed the conversation in his mind, wondering if he had seemed selfish, cold, or unreliable. Some colleagues noticed the change and made small comments, the kind people make when someone stops being as freely available as they once were. Comments disguised as jokes, but carrying a quiet pressure to return to the old ways. This is one of the most important things to understand about setting boundaries. The people who react most strongly to them are almost always the ones who benefited most from your lack of them. Daniel was beginning to learn this truth firsthand.
He went to Rosa and told her everything. The guilt, the second-guessing, the comments. She listened without interrupting, the way people listen when they already understand the terrain you are describing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said something that rearranged something inside him permanently. "Daniel," she said, "people don't resent you for saying no. They resent you for making them realize they were never really considering your well-being to begin with. That discomfort isn't yours to carry, it's theirs to examine." He turned those words over for days, because she was right. The guilt he felt every time he protected his own time and energy was not a sign that he was doing something wrong. It was simply the sound of an old story losing its grip. And that sound, however uncomfortable, was actually the sound of healing. Among all the relationships in Daniel's life, there was one that the new boundaries illuminated most painfully. His oldest friend, Marcus, had known Daniel since childhood and had, without either of them ever acknowledging it, built their entire friendship on a particular unspoken agreement. Marcus called when he needed advice. Marcus visited when he needed support. Marcus borrowed money, borrowed time, borrowed emotional energy, and Daniel had given it all freely, convincing himself that this was simply what deep friendship looked like. But when Daniel began to reciprocate, when he called Marcus during a difficult week and asked for support in return, the conversation was short, distracted, and hollow. Marcus had somewhere to be.
In the quiet after that phone call, Daniel understood something painful and clarifying at once. Some relationships are not built on mutual love. They are built on one person's unlimited willingness to give, and they only survive for as long as that willingness remains unconditional.
Nobody tells you about this part. Nobody warns you that when you begin to value yourself, some of the people around you will quietly disappear. Not because you have done anything wrong, but because the version of you they needed no longer exists. Daniel grieved this. He sat with the grief honestly, without rushing past it or dressing it up as something easier to hold. Because growth without grief is not real growth. It is just performance. He had lost a version of a friendship he had cherished for 30 years. He had lost the comfortable numbness of always being busy with other people's needs. He had lost the identity of being the one everyone could count on. And even though that identity had been slowly suffocating him, it had still been his. Letting it go felt like standing in an open field with no shelter in sight. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, he could also feel the wind.
Spring arrived in Millhaven the way it always did. Quietly at first, then all at once. And something in Daniel arrived the same way. He began, carefully and deliberately, to rebuild his days around a question he had never once thought to ask himself. What do I actually want? Not what was expected of him, not what would make someone else comfortable, not what would earn him approval or protect him from disappointment. What did he want? It was a question so simple that its simplicity was almost embarrassing, and yet he discovered, in trying to answer it, that he had spent so many years outsourcing his choices to other people's needs that he had lost fluency in his own desires entirely. He started small. A Saturday morning kept entirely for himself. A book he had meant to read for 3 years finally opened. A long walk taken for no reason, except that the air was cool and the path was quiet, and he had nowhere to be but exactly where he was.
As Daniel changed, something unexpected happened to the relationships around him. The ones that had been built on genuine affection, not transaction, not convenience, but real human warmth, did not wither under the new boundaries. They deepened. Because when Daniel stopped being endlessly available, the people who truly cared about him began to show up differently. They stopped assuming and started asking. They stopped taking and started reciprocating. Rosa became a real friend, the kind built on honest conversation and mutual respect. A few colleagues he had never had time to truly know began to reveal themselves as remarkably thoughtful, interesting people. He understood now that his old way of relating to people had actually kept genuine connection at a distance. When you give everything to everyone, you give nothing fully to anyone. And real intimacy requires the kind of presence that only becomes possible when you have first protected your own.
One afternoon, Daniel was teaching his students about the water cycle, how clouds gather moisture, hold it, and release it as rain that feeds rivers, forests, and fields. A student raised her hand and asked why clouds don't just release all their water at once. Daniel paused, and then, almost without planning it, he turned the question into something larger. He told his students that everything in nature operates on the principle of sustainable giving. A river that empties itself completely runs dry and can water nothing. A tree that gives all its energy to fruit in a single season will not survive the winter. Even the sun, he told them, is 93 million miles away, not because it doesn't care about the earth, but because at the right distance, its light gives life, and too close, it would consume everything it was meant to nurture. The classroom was unusually quiet when he finished, and Daniel realized he had just taught himself the lesson more fully than he had ever taught any student.
That evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the same table where months earlier he had sat hollow and disappearing, and he wrote a letter. Not to anyone in particular. A letter to the version of himself that had spent 42 years believing that his worth was measured by his usefulness. He wrote without editing, without pausing, without performing. He thanked that version of himself for trying so hard. He acknowledged that the people-pleasing had not come from weakness. It had come from a deep, sincere desire to be loved. And there was nothing shameful in that desire. But he also wrote the truth, that no amount of saying yes to the world would ever fill the space that could only be filled by saying yes to yourself. That boundaries are not walls built to keep people out. They are the architecture of a life that is genuinely, sustainably yours. He folded the letter, placed it in his drawer, and felt something settle in his chest that he could only describe Here is what Daniel's story teaches us, and what so many of us spend entire lifetimes learning the hard way. The most generous thing you can do for the world is not to give it everything you have until nothing remains. It is to protect enough of yourself that you can continue to give from a place of fullness rather than depletion. Saying no is not a rejection of others. It is an act of honesty, of integrity, and ultimately of deeper love. Because when you say no to what drains you, you are saying yes to what truly matters. You are saying yes to your health, your dreams, your genuine relationships, and the quiet, unhurried life that is waiting for you, just on the other side of your fear of disappointing people. Daniel learned this at 42. Some people learn it later. Some, tragically, never do. But if you are watching this today, something in you already knows the truth that this story has been carrying from the very first word. That your life is not a resource for the world to consume. It is a gift. And gifts, to mean anything at all, must first be cherished by the one who holds them.